Hello viewers, welcome back to the NPTEL's basic course in ornithology. In this video, we will learn about the evolutionary origin of birds and how and when modern birds evolved. We will also look at the phenomenon of adaptive radiation, a process of rapid speciation in a small geographic area. As we know, birds are perhaps the best studied groups of animals in the world. But ironically, origin of birds also remains one of the most contentious topics that has led to some of the most bitter rivalries that we know in biology. Paleontologists and evolutionists continue to spar over the origin of birds. It's an interesting story. So we will now see what are the major theories of origin of birds and also the origin of flight, because both the origin of birds and the origin of flight are actually very closely intertwined, and different viewpoints put forward in support of their hypothesis and also evidences against their competing hypothesis. So origin of birds remains the most debated topic. We all agree, in fact everyone agrees, there is no true opinion about where birds evolved from. Birds evolved from reptiles. In fact, birds are often often mentioned as glorified reptiles. But the actual difference of opinion lies in the phylogeny and the time of divergence. So whether the birds originated from the theropod dinosaurs, the much later period, or did they originate from the archosaurian reptiles, which are the common ancestors to both dinosaurs and birds. So that's the bone of contention between these two groups. So, the discovery of the Archaeopteryx limestone fossils in Bavaria, Germany in late 19th century is the turning point in the history of studies on origin of birds. So it was Hermann von Meyer who actually discovered the limestone fossils of Archaeopteryx. First a feather, which you can see there, and followed by a series of 7 to 8 series of fully articulated skeletal specimens in 1877. So then of course the type specimen of Archaeopteryx, it was just the time when Charles Darwin actually published in The Origin of Species the iconic theory, which put forward natural selection as the basis for the evolution of organisms in 1859. So what you see is that artists' impression about how an Archaeopteryx would have actually looked like if it had been alive today, based on the skeletal structures and feather sediments. So it was the Richard Owen, the curator of British Museum of Natural History. He procured the full skeletal specimen but without head. Richard Owen is a very legendary paleontologist, biologist, and Owen also is very strongly skeptical about Charles Darwin's natural selection theory. So Owen said that Archaeopteryx actually was a bird and it is not an intermediate taxon as predicted by Charles Darwin. In fact, Darwin was actually looking for to an intermediate form, because he proposed that birds to evolve from reptiles, but the fossil evidence were not to be seen. What would be the intermediate form that would actually prove that birds did evolve from reptiles as predicted by the theory of natural selection. So, but Thomas Huxley, often called in the history of biology as the bulldog of Charles Darwin, a very strong supporter of Darwin. So he argued that Archaeopteryx was in fact a transitional form. It confirms the evolutionary theory. So there was a war of words erupted between Richard Owen and Thomas Huxley. And later, specimens, because when Richard collected his fully articulated specimen, but his specimen did not have the head. So when a fully conserved specimen did emerge, it turned out that Archaeopteryx actually did have a beak with teeth. So, ancestral characteristics of the reptiles. So it kind of, it was kind of a, intermediate, have characters which is common to both reptiles and birds. So Richard Owen was apparently disappointed with that discovery that they could actually be the intermediate form, confirming the Darwin's theory of natural selection. So, well, is Archaeopteryx a bird or a reptile? So it's a, it's an intermediate form as it turns out to be. Now let's see some of the key characters which are actually, found in Archaeopteryx. So the reptilian characters that you would see, what you see here is on the left side is the, skeletal of Archaeopteryx, and the right side is the modern pigeon. So the reptilian characters include the toothed mandible, because then also the long bony tail with a series of caudal vertebrae, basically elongated caudal vertebrate. But on the other hand, the modern pigeon has the expanded brain case. So that's also found in the, the Archaeopteryx, and the fused arm bones, single reinforced pelvic bone, and a strong fulcrum, caudal vertebrate fused into pygostyle. That's the, that's what you don't find in the Archaeopteryx, but that's you found in the modern birds. And rib cage strengthened with the uncinate process, basically, to enable the modern birds to fly, so that, fly not at the cost of the body weight. The body weight, it's a trade-off between the body weight and the, the aerodynamic lift. And also the well-developed sternum, because of the flight is a very, energetically costly mechanism. So these are the characteristics that the modern birds had. So in a sense, the Archaeopteryx was, this intermediate between reptiles and birds. There are certain cranial synapomorphies. Synapomorphy actually means, derived shared characters. Basically, in phylogenetic studies, the synapomorphy versus simpliciomorphy. So synapomorphies are the one characters that actually, taxonomists and biologists look for. So what are these cranial, that is the synapomorphic characters in the cranial, that along the head, around the brain case, that we see in reptiles and birds. So let's see, these are the, the sketch of a skull. So you can see the sclerotic ring that supports the eye, So this is a character that is both common to reptile and bird. Expanded lateral brain case of, to accommodate a larger brain. Single middle ear bone, that's again common to reptiles and birds, and single occipital condyle, in contrast to, 2 or 3 in lesser vertebrates. And also the lower jaw structure and articulation. So composed of multiple bones, the lower jaw. So these are the characters which are actually, not found in their ancestor of the both reptiles and birds, as they share the same common ancestor, but they are found in both reptiles and birds, the derived taxa. That's why we call the term as synapomorphy. So there are also other characteristics that has been common in between reptiles and birds. One is that reptilian scales and bird feathers are homologous. So in other words, they have the same evolutionary pathway or ontogeny. But this is the point that's still being debated. But nonetheless, it's more or less, it's it's accepted. So both reptiles and birds have nucleated red blood cells. So that again, it's a differentiate them from the other vertebrates other than the mammals. In both reptiles and birds, females are the heterogametic sex. So for ZW, so the females, like the sex chromosomes will be like in mammals. The sex chromosomes are XX, double X in females and XY in males. but in reptiles and birds, the females are ZW and the males will be WW. So it's an extremely important, the distinction, and it has a very larger ramifications in population genetics. And of course, the oogenesis, the developmental ontogeny of the egg and yolk egg development, it's common to both taxa. So these are the characteristics, the key characters that are found common between birds and reptiles. So yes, that these characters, both cranial characters and these anatomical and hematological characters do prove that reptiles and birds had common ancestors. So now let's see the history of the different theories on origin of birds. So theories of origin of birds can be actually divided into 3 eras in the history, right from the middle of the 19th century to the current era. So the first era would actually range from late 19th century to early 20th century. So this is the era which is dominated by Thomas Huxley, the very strong supporter of Darwin's theory of natural selection. So Huxley proposed that birds originated from theropods. So theropods are actually dinosaurs. It's a group of dinosaurs, a clade of primarily carnivorous Saurischian dinosaurs. These dinosaurs have multiple lineages. So these belong to the theropods are actually a group of Saurischian dinosaurs with 3-toed limbs. All the 3 toes pointed forward. So what you see here is the Ceratosaurus, which is probably the most closest to the the modern birds in terms of phylogeny among the dinosaurs. So this is a diagram which would show the actual origin of birds along the geological time scale. So as you know, the geological time scales have been divided into like era, period. So an era is the Mesozoic era, that's the age of reptiles, and the period Mesozoic era is again divided into 3 periods: Triassic, Jurassic and Cretaceous. So this is the millions of years ago. So like for example, from like 250 to 200 million years ago, it's a Triassic period, and 200 to 145 million years ago is Jurassic, and 145 to 65 million years ago is the Cretaceous. And these 3 periods constitute the Mesozoic era, which is generally known as the age of reptiles and also birds, since they are the glorified reptiles. And the Tertiary is the next one, is the Cenozoic era, that's the age of modern birds and mammals. That's the 3 million years ago to 66 million years ago. That's the tertiary period. So this is how the geological time is divided. So if you look carefully along this figure, the original things are the thecodonts. They are the archosaurs. Thecodonts are actually ancestors of both dinosaurs, also reptiles and also the birds. So from thecodonts originated the crocodilians, in Triassic period, early Triassic period. Then of course the middle Triassic period, the sauropod dinosaurs and theropod dinosaurs, together they are called as Saurischian dinosaurs, they diverged, they originated. And then by middle to the later Triassic period is the Ornithischian dinosaurs, or they are herbivores, and also the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles. So this is the general accepted view of the diversification of the dinosaurs. Now Thomas Huxley, he proposed the theory that like Archaeopteryx and then the early birds ancestors, they have probably diverged from the theropod dinosaurs, and so sometime the middle of the Jurassic, maybe it's around 150 to 160 million years ago. So the theropod dinosaurs, they gave way to a group of ancestral taxa which again diversified into dromaeosaurs, enantheroids and ornithurae. That's the modern birds. And Archaeopteryx is sometimes late Jurassic period. So it is the, what Thomas Huxley says is that the birds actually originated from theropod dinosaurs around the Jurassic and also the, the early Cretaceous, the modern birds. So this is the hypothesis which Thomas Huxley proposed by studying various fossils of the various fossil dinosaurs that has been obtained. And thereafter there's a big debate, the great debate. If you know the history of biology, you would know the great debate between Thomas Huxley and Samuel Wilberforce. Samuel Wilberforce in fact was the spokesperson for Richard Owen and also the theology, the so-called the theology in the 18th and early 19th century. So the next almost 40 to 50 years, Thomas Huxley spent time on actually, it's arguments, counter arguments and, and debates with the creationists led by Samuel Wilberforce. And so the whole theory of the theropod dinosaurs theory got, completely buried under, because of that, because of the war of words between these two over the actual theory of natural selection. Now the second era started 1920s after the Thomas Huxley's period. And the second era, the dominant hypothesis was that, well, the birds did not originate from the theropod dinosaurs, but they originated, thecodonts, that is the much earlier, along with crocodiles and dinosaurs, ancestors which are also ancestors for crocodilians, dinosaurs, and so they are called archosaurian reptiles. Now this hypothesis was put forward by Gerard Heilmann. Actually he was a porcelain artist, but a very polymath, one of the, considered as one of the brilliant biologists, which is not formally trained in biology. So Gerard Heilmann, an Austrian, he actually published the book on origin of birds in the early 20th century, which propounded saying that the birds did not evolve from dinosaurs but from the archosaurian reptiles along with crocodilians and, the other reptiles. So the same, time graph, but instead of the, earlier Thomas Huxley said the birds originated here, from late Jurassic, from the theropod dinosaurs. But now Heilmann, what he says is that no, actually they originated not 150 million years ago, but around 200 million, the early 200 million years ago, they are the Archaeopteryx and other, the ancestral taxa for birds, they originated from thecodonts, what's called archosaurs. So the archosaurian reptiles, they are called as thecodonts. So the birds actually diverged from the archosaurian reptiles late Triassic period, almost 180 to 200 million years ago instead of 160 million years ago. Almost, he pushed the date of divergence to almost 60 to 80 million years before. And also he propounded by saying that they had the common ancestors as shared with the crocodilians and dinosaurs and, the both, and also the pterosaurs and other dinosaurs. So this is the argument put forward by Heilmann, and this turned out to be the most influential hypothesis for most part of 20th century. And so the second era, say that okay, birds are not dinosaurs, but they are actually share the ancestor with, dinosaurs and crocodilians in the archosaurian reptiles. So it was also supported, this hypothesis was supported by absence of clavicles in theropods. See, remember, Huxley said that birds diverged from theropod dinosaurs, but the theropod dinosaurs did not have the clavicles. Clavicles are the shoulder bones, and so he says that, so how could the birds would have diverged from them? But he says that the clavicles were present in the the thecodonts, and also the hand dactyly, basically the toe structure, so which we'll see a little later. So one of the things which Heilmann was very confident is that he was actually misled by what we call Louis Dallow's law of evolutionary irreversibility. See, sometime in the middle of 20th century, Louis Dallow, he propounded saying that in an evolutionary lineage, any trait or any characteristic or any trait, if it once disappears, cannot reappear in a line. So once it is lost for permanently. So it's called law of evolutionary irreversibility. So this is the law that that strongly was believed by many biologists in most part of the 20th century. And so Gerard Heilmann went by this law and say that the theropods did the clavicles were absent in theropods, so they cannot reappear in birds. So but thecodonts had clavicles, or the equivalent of clavicles. So it was as per the Dallow's law, it is very much likely that the thecodonts gave birth to birds than the theropod dinosaurs. So that was his argument. So now the era 3, the third era, 1970s onwards. So this is the very interesting thing, is that it was now the entire hypothesis hovered back to Huxley's original hypothesis of birds as descendants of theropod dinosaurs. So it was actually revived by John Ostrom. Ostrom is also not a trained biologist, but he was a very well respected paleontologist, and he probably did the most extensively. He did very systematically studied the fossils and other evidences, and he disproved Heilmann, and saying that theropod dinosaurs actually with clavicles were discovered much later. So probably Heilmann did not have access to them, though those dinosaurs, theropod dinosaurs. So it is wrong to say that characters or traits. First thing is that it's wrong to say that characters cannot re-emerge along the lineage, as what believed by Louis Dallow. But also it is true that the theropod dinosaurs with clavicles were found. And now the most damning evidence in support of theropod dinosaurs theory came from China. In the late Cretaceous China, 1996, one of the most interesting fossil of Sinosauropteryx, it was named, was discovered by Ji Guang and his team from China, and it was a very tiny theropod dinosaurs with feathers. So this kind of sealed the debate in favor of the theropod dinosaurs. So it clearly showed that later theropod dinosaurs with much smaller in size, they had feathers, developed feathers, these things. So this Sinosauropteryx actually turned out to be one of the, it's a turning point in the study of history of origin of birds or the bird flight. In fact, in a recent book, Ted Anderson, he went on to say in his book on house sparrow, saying that the world's most ubiquitous extant theropod today is the house sparrow. So now, what are the evidences for theropod origin of birds put forward by the things? So gradualism in bone density reconstitution, because the bone density in birds have to be much less but stronger but lighter bones that would enable them for flight in the modern birds. Reduction in caudal vertebrae, as you remember, the Archaeopteryx had a long tail with the caudal vertebrae. Hind limb myology, and also the reinforcement of the pelvic girdle. So the pelvic girdle got really strengthened in modern birds. And so these are some of the characters that could easily we see the gradualism from theropod dinosaurs to the modern ancestors of the modern birds. And even the later theropods. So see, can you see the, the red colored bone highlighted here in the skeleton of a modern bird? So that's called a wishbone. That's the furcula, what we call wishbone. So in chicken, so the furcula, the furculum is the, that clavicle. They are actually the ones which actually clavicles in the later theropods fused to form the furcula. So that's again very strong evidence for the origin of birds from the theropod dinosaurs. And of course, there's a series of phylogenetic studies which looked at the synapomorphic characters, across the range of dinosaurs, fossils of dinosaurs, also the fossils of the modern birds in the early era. So what are the arguments against theropod origins? Of course, Heilman and his team, they first proposed saying that the birds did not originate from dinosaurs but originate from the thecodonts. That's much, 180 million years ago. Now, what are those evidences against the theropod? Why birds cannot have, originated from dinosaurs? One is that the dromaeosaurs. See, dromaeosaurs are sister taxa to the ancient avian lineage. So, the characteristics of dromaeosaurus were very closely studied because they would actually tell us which are the synapomorphic characters or simpliciomorphic characters that would be shared with the modern birds. Now, the dromaeosaurs fossils showed both flight and flightlessness along with feather degeneration. So, they say that, that means that the dromaeosaurs, since they show both flight and flightlessness, they could not have been the origin of the birds. And homology of hand dactyly. So, in modern birds, if you see these things, modern birds, the hind toe is called the hallux, the first digit. Most, only the passerine it is well developed, although it's one of non-passerine birds which are very short, either short or sometimes even absent. But what we see very prominently is that the inner digit, that's the second digit, third digit and the fourth digit. Now, modern birds have only the digits, conventionally speaking, 2, 3 and 4, and 1 and 5, the fifth digit is lost or reduced. The first is actually reduced or lost, and fifth is almost lost. So this is actually very similar to the thecodont, not dinosaurs, thecodonts, but not in theropod dinosaurs. But the response from theropod groups, the dinosaurs, birds are dinosaurs, that group, they say that the multiple appearance and disappearance of the traits through the phylogenetic pathway, actually they are not uncommon, contra Dollo's law. In fact, Dollo's law, now it's been, increasingly disproved, with findings actually contrary to what Dollo proposed. So it's like bad versus band. So birds are dinosaurs versus birds are not dinosaurs war. So that war still goes on.